joining again. This is our 5th Time for You session, and we appreciate that you're all so busy at the moment that it's difficult to get that time for yourself, but it's really important that you do get that time for yourself at the moment. I'd like to welcome back Marion Langsford and Julie Henshelwood from the Emotional Logic Centre, and they will be presenting at the session today. So some of you may have joined the first session. This is our 2nd session today with Marion and Julie. And just emotional logic is about understanding and making sense of our emotions and how you can face life challenges and build emotional resilience and embrace change. Just a couple of items to go through. Please can you stay on mute throughout the session unless you're invited to unmute. Please can you post your any questions in the chat box, and we are recording the session. Some of the questions will be answered in the Q&A session at the end of the session, and any questions that go unanswered we will collate and get a response back to you shortly after the meeting. So I thought the first session went really well and we had really good feedback so I just want to hand over to Marion and Julie, and I hope you get real benefit from the session. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniel. It's really good to be back here again, talking to you all. So we're going to talk about emotional logic, which is something that both of us are pretty passionate about, as you'll probably gather. So I'm Marion, and I was a GP for almost 40 years in Ivy Bridge in southwest Devon, and I retired almost 2 years ago and then went back to do some CCAS work and some vaccinating and various things. But I'm mostly these days doing emotional logic, which I'm passionate about, and I love teaching it. I use it for myself all the time. I used to use it for my patients when I was in practice, and now I teach it at all sorts of levels. Julie.
Hi, I'm Julie Henshelwood. Like Marion, I'm absolutely passionate about emotional logic and hope that we can see it roll out into the whole of the NHS as a wellbeing resource. I used to be a GP for about 30 years and was a tutor and appraiser, a mentor and a trainer, and also had the pleasure of working on the Isle of Mull for a couple of years as a remote rural practitioner, and now work exclusively with the Emotional Logic Centre, spreading the word and supporting people in their areas of work. Back to Marion.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So I apologise for those of you who were in the session a fortnight ago, but obviously there are people in this one that weren't in the last one, so we do need to bring people a little bit up to speed about what it's all about. So this diagram we call the life cycle diagram, and it's about what happens generally in life. So in the middle there, we've got something that we call love, but actually that's just about anything at all that we value, absolutely anything. So if I've got a favorite pen that I like writing with and it goes missing, then that's one of the things that can set off a grief reaction. So when the pen's writing well, then that's joy. But when the pen goes missing, that's a disappointment. And logically, the first emotion then is shock. And then there's a whole series of other emotions, most of which feel really uncomfortable. But there's a way out. In fact, there are 2 ways out. The bargaining and acceptance are the 2 ways back up to the top again. And we're calling it grief, but people sometimes think that's about bereavement, which of course is the most serious form of grief. But every day we have griefs going on all the time. In emotional logic, we're looking at the everyday griefs. Next one, please. So I call these the mind shifts. So this is just some things that we look at differently in emotional logic than perhaps people are used to. So as I've just said, grief's not just about bereavement. We all have losses every day, some of them small, some of them large, and all of them will set off a loss reaction, which is a process. So grief, sometimes people think grief is one emotion. It's not. It's a series of emotions, a loss reaction. Now, we only have a loss reaction if it's something that we value that's lost or threatened. So if we start looking at people's loss reactions, that actually gives us a little insight into what their values are. And that can be really important. All the grief emotions have useful purposes. Now, this is probably the most surprising thing in this list for you people that are all involved in health anyway, that the emotions that can be really unpleasant, which some people call negative, but we don't call them negative in emotional logic. We call them unpleasant emotions that have useful purposes. And we believe that they're all there on purpose to help us adjust, to help us to move through the process. They're not meant to be pleasant because we're not supposed to stick with them. They're supposed to keep us moving. Now, emotions are physical. And being medical people, you'll understand that, particularly when we think about shock with the adrenaline and cortisol and all those things going on. But all the emotions of loss are physical. What we have in our mind are just the feelings of the emotion. And they can be quite individual depending on a person's memories and culture. But we've found that the emotions are common to all the different cultures that we've done this in, and that are quite a lot now. So we do differentiate between the emotions, which are core and physical and common to humankind, and the feelings of the emotion, which are individual for different people and are the things that we experience in our consciousness. And then lastly, emotions are about communication. They're about communication both within ourselves, telling us, look out, something's going on here, something that you value is being threatened, but also about communication with other people. Otherwise, why would an emotion have a facial expression? If it's all individual, my emotion is all about me, why should there be a facial expression involved? But it's about communicating with other people that something's going on as well. Did you have anything to add to that, Julie?
Well, I was going to say that the current sort of paradigm of our approach to emotions is that emotions are very unwelcome. And in our culture, we have a real sort of culture to avoid unpleasant emotions. We don't like feeling discomfort. And so our emotions, which are actually trying to give us very important signals about the fact that something we value is being threatened, are more often than not treated as unwelcome and really need to be controlled, regulated, got rid of. And really, many of the current interventions that we encounter in mental health are trying to regulate our emotions. For instance, anger. It's really bad, regulate it, don't experience anger. And we're trying to show people a completely different understanding of our very useful but often unpleasant emotions that are there to drive us through these difficult times and setbacks. So it's just reframing our actual perception of our emotions. Thanks, Marion.
Thanks. Next slide, please. So this rather complex diagram is called turning points diagram, which is also a rather complex name. But you will recognize in there the 7 emotions that were described by the British hospice movement as the stages of grieving. Now, emotional logic doesn't talk about stages. We recognize these same 7 emotions, but we talk about stepping stones, because we find that when people are using these emotions to move through a grief process, which is not necessarily a bereavement, but any sort of a grief process, they jump around on them. They don't do them logically. This just shows people the logic. So there is a logic, but people don't do it logically, and that's absolutely fine. We don't have to do it logically because we're human beings, but sometimes it's useful to know that there is a logic. So the first 2, the shock and denial, are about recognizing. The anger and guilt are about preventing the loss of something. Bargaining and depression are about recovering, and acceptance is about letting go. And as you'll see, some of them are about things that you do out in the world, and some of them are things that are more internal to us. And you won't be able to read it, but at the bottom, there is the useful purpose of each of those emotional stepping stones. Each of them does have a useful purpose to keep us moving through the process. If we had lots of time, we could go through the useful purposes of them all. But I think today we need to keep moving on. And we will see the useful purposes of some of them as we go. Do you want to say anything about that, Julie?
I was just going to add, there's something I've just been talking to someone about this morning, actually, that really when we are looking at emotions and reframing them in this way, helping people understand the useful purpose of their emotions, another thing happens that really is core to the reason why emotional logic is so amazing. And that is that we are marrying reason with emotion. We're actually giving emotions a little bit more objectivity. They're not so hot and unacceptable to us. We're actually cooling down our understanding of them, standing back and actually looking at them in a much more objective way. And that is one of the ways that emotional logic can help people look at the emotions they're experiencing and not feel ashamed about them and not feel upset by them and actually see them for what they really are. And that can be very, very powerful. Thanks, Marion.
Okay, next slide, please. So we did promise those of you that were with us a fortnight ago that we would talk a little bit more about whirlpools this time, because this is the sort of next level on from the simple stages that you had last time. And I'm sorry for those of you that missed the simple stages, but we could fill you in later on if you wanted to. But this is what happens when two of those healthy stepping stones, those emotions that are designed to keep us moving through the process, when two of them get tied up together, we call them preparations for action. So they're telling us either we've got to go out into the world and do something, or we've got to look inside ourselves and do something. And each of them has a healthy, useful purpose. But if two of them get muddled up together, then we can become very stuck. And we've got some examples of that. But before I go to that, I just want to tell you a little bit about how these were identified, because whirlpools of emotion are very unique to emotional logic. So these were discovered in general practice. And what happened was people coming in with certain symptom complexes or mental health style complaints or some physical complaints were asked to identify what emotions were going on for them at the time. And so it was an empirical discovery that people with certain behavior symptoms came up with the same two emotions time after time after time. So it was an empirical discovery. It wasn't something that was worked out. It was just discovered. And then afterwards, when you think about it, you can see quite often why that happens. But that's not how they were found. The other thing about them is that people sometimes worry that they're prescriptive, that if I've got this emotion and this emotion, I'm always going to have that sort of a whirlpool. But that's not always the case. Sometimes people have got cards that look as if they've got whirlpools, but they're not actually at all. And we all have them. Actually, we all have our own favorite whirlpools that we go to. And that's fine, because if we know that we're going to a whirlpool and we can understand what the useful purpose of those two emotions is, we can step out of it quite easily. We call that a fleeting whirlpool. But there are some people who have really entrenched, very stuck whirlpools. And those ones are a bit more difficult to untangle. And that's where somebody who's trained as an emotional logic coach can be quite helpful to help untangle that. Do you want to say anything there, Julie, before we go on?
No, that's lovely, Marion.
Okay, next one, please. So this is just an example here. So I talked about cards. We've got two sorts of cards, but these we call them, that we're showing you today, we're calling the picture cards. And these ones we use for people to show us how they're feeling in a situation. So in emotional logic, we don't say, tell me how you felt with that situation. We say, think about a small thing that's happened, and it has to be a small thing because we don't want to send people back into shock about big things. Tell me how your emotions went. Show me, using these cards, how your emotions went in that situation. And then we know that each of them has got a useful purpose, which is written on the back of the card. So this is the front of the card with the back of the card next to it. So shock, which you remember usually comes logically at the beginning of the process, has a useful purpose. It's telling us, stop what you're doing and find a safe place to review your resources, to work out what you're going to do about this situation. That's what shock means. Next slide, please. This is anger. This is the useful purpose of anger. It gives energy to take action out in the world and change something there. As Julie said earlier on, people don't always recognize that anger can be useful. They think it's always a bad thing. But without anger, nothing would ever change, really. I think if you think about some of the real changes, movers and shakers in this world, changing things for good, like William Wilberforce, for example, it was his anger that enabled him to just keep on keeping on to get some change. So anger is good as long as it's used for its useful purpose. Next slide. But what about if somebody's feeling shocked, they're getting the stop signal, and at the same time they're feeling angry, they're getting the get out there and do something signal. That does feel strange, doesn't it? Now, I'm going to give you a little exercise to do. Now, I can't see any of you and nobody else can see any of you. So do feel free to really take part in this little exercise. It's a little drama. So I want you all, and I'm going to do it as well, to do a shocked expression just for a couple of seconds. Pretend that you've had a really shocking thing said to you. Okay, done that? Now, just for a couple of seconds, make a really angry face and body language. You're feeling really furious. Okay, thank you. Now, I'd like you to do both of those things at the same time. Well, I'm finding it really hard. I don't know whether you are because I can't see any of you, but I think it feels quite strange doing that, and it's like experiencing a whirlpool. Can we have the next one? So when we get shock and anger tied up together, we recognize that as a confusion whirlpool. And I don't know about you, but I find if I'm trying to make myself do a shocked face and an angry face at the same time, that makes me feel confused. So that's just demonstrating that. Can I have another one? Okay, so what about these two? We've got lots of positive things to say about denial when it's being used for its useful purpose. As medical professionals, all of us have to be using denial all the time, don't we? We get something happening during during our working day, maybe that actually, was a bit of a disappointment or a setback. But we've got all these patients we've got to go and see, or we've got all this paperwork that we've got to do, or we've got emails to answer, or whatever it might be. And we've just got to put that disappointment into denial so as we can get on with our work. That's what being a professional is. Trouble is, it's a bit like the freezer. If you keep on and on and on stuffing more and more stuff in it, eventually it starts getting a bit full, and then it starts consuming all your electricity to keep it frozen. When it comes out, it's just as raw as when it went in. So what about if shock and denial get tied up together? So lots of stuff going on that is quite shocking, but you can't cope with it now because you're too busy. There's other stuff going on. Or maybe you've just got no safe places actually to work it through. Remember, shock is about stop what you're doing and find a safe place. No safe place? Okay, we'll just stick it into the denial freezer. Next one. So this is the root of post-traumatic stress disorder. And this was, don't forget, this was found quite empirically by talking to lots of people with post-traumatic stress disorder, getting them to put the cards down and finding that these were the two emotions that were lying on top of each other. And I think there's a lot of this about at the moment, isn't there? People feeling brittle and anxious, self-doubting, fearful and stressed. Lots of that about. People not having enough safe places or not recognizing their shock. Did you want to add anything to that at the moment, Julie?
Not really, except to say that denial, of course, can be a safe place temporarily, as you've said. Putting it in the freezer is fantastic, and it really is a safe place. So it's not something to be ashamed of if you're using it. It's something to be celebrated, that you can actually continue with your day, pop it in denial, and then look at it later when you have found your safe place to explore it more.
Yeah, thank you. That's important. Next one, please. So I'm not expecting you to read all the writing on this, but this is just to give you an idea that these are the common whirlpools that we've known about for a couple of decades, probably. We keep finding more. That's not true. We don't keep finding more, but we have found a few more since then. But these are the commonest ones. These are the ones that were identified in general practice when people came in and started to look at the emotions behind what was going on for them. So thank you to the person, I think it was Alex, who asked a question last time about a whirlpool that we hadn't described as yet. The question was asked, what about imposter syndrome? And actually that was very helpful, thank you, because we went away to our trainer training group and all had a go at thinking about imposter syndrome. And actually one of the trainers had actually been dealing with a person with that very syndrome. Actually, I think it was that same day. And we decided that certainly for each of them, there was a shock guilt whirlpool going on, a bit like the shame one, but that possibly there was a little bit of a third emotion overlying it as well, maybe a bit of denial sitting on top of it. Anyway, there's an ongoing conversation to be had there. So I'm going to hand over to Julie now to talk about this story, follow on the story that we had last time. Next slide, please.
So, yes, for those of you who were here last week, Marion told you all about Joe, who is actually a friend of mine, who is a salaried GP in England. And for those of you who weren't here, I'll just recap the story a little bit. Joe phoned me up and said that she was keen to discuss with me how she was going to present herself at a new interview for a new job as a salaried doctor. And I was absolutely stunned because I knew that Joe really loved her job and that she was really keen to stay in her job with the people she's been working with for the last 20 years nearly. And I couldn't believe that she wanted to leave. So I said, well, Joe, why don't you nip over and we'll have a chat about this? Let's just, take a step back here. Let's see what's happened. And Joe told me the story as well as using the cards, and that's really important. She showed me how she felt when this event occurred. She was working in the surgery. She was not duty doctor. And it's useful to know that she'd already dropped down from being a partner to being a salaried doctor to give herself time and a bit more headspace and a bit more control over her workload. And she said that at about 6:20 in the evening, not duty doctor, she started seeing lots of phone calls coming in on her screen. And she felt quite upset. So immediately, as she was putting the cards down and externally mapping her emotional response to this, she said, I felt really angry. I wasn't duty doctor, and yet all these phone calls are coming in. And then I felt quite powerless and helpless and hopeless because I realised that I was going to have to deal with them. I can't just walk away from them. You know, I've got to deal with this. I don't know where the duty doctor is. And then I felt guilty that I shouldn't actually be feeling like this because I love my job and these people obviously need help and they're ringing up. And but anyway, she decided to take a little bit of action straight away and to bargain back a little bit of understanding and clarity on the situation. She rang the receptionists and said, why isn't this going through to Peter, the duty doctor? And they said, oh, he's gone home, he's doing a visit, and then he's gone on from the visit to go directly home. And obviously he's got his children, he's got his little children to look after. And Joe was thinking, well, I've got children to go back to, but they're just slightly older. So maybe I'm not making the grade of reception sympathy here very much. Anyway, she decided she'd obviously do the calls and she went home and she talked to her husband and she was a bit upset about it and she got a bit shouty with her 3 teenage children because she was being criticised for coming home late yet again. And she said, well, it's not my fault. And started to dip into this anger, depression whirlpool, which makes people feel often very combative. So she was starting to feel quite angry already. And then she decided that the next day she was going to take this in hand. And she told me that she had sorted it out. She had gone and spoken to the practice manager and said that she wasn't going to put up with this anymore. But nothing happened. And she felt very upset, even more depressed, powerless, helpless and hopeless, and even more angry. And I said to her, well, what actually did you do to enable you to say that you've sorted this problem out? And she said, oh, I just loitered outside the practice manager's door, and she didn't really listen to what I was saying. And, but she should have heard me. And it's just utterly ridiculous, this situation. I can't carry on like this. Next slide, please. So as part of our chat together, I asked her to fill out what we call a loss reaction worksheet, basically just a list of her losses that she was now experiencing as a result of this event. So she was feeling that she'd lost fairness, she wasn't being treated with consideration, she'd lost respect from her colleagues, and lower down on the list, respect for her colleagues. She really felt that she'd lost being heard, which is a really core need in all of us. She didn't feel heard. She'd lost self-respect because she said, well, I tried to bargain this back and nothing's happened. They just walked all over me. She feels she's lost control of her workload. I wasn't duty doctor, but they kept piling the work on. So therefore, I didn't leave in good time. She'd lost that. She'd lost time with her family. She'd lost enjoyment of her work. I love my work, she said, but I can't carry on like this. And she'd lost faith in the teamwork ethos. And she'd also lost respect for her colleagues, as I said before. And she'd got tics in the anger column and also in the depression column, which reflects the same pattern that we saw. Her anger energy was getting really entangled with her depression energy. And depression has a useful purpose, which we'll come on to look at in a minute. But I was focusing here at that time thinking, well, what did you do to bargain back any of these losses? Oh, well, I told you I was speaking to the practice manager. But I challenged her a little bit and I said, well, let's go into it in a bit more detail. Did you use assertive bargaining? And she said, well, what do you mean by assertive bargaining? And so I started to talk to her about the different types of bargaining. And whenever we're stuck in a pattern where one emotional preparation state has got entangled with another, the aim is to recover things by using assertive bargaining. And it is really important to realize that at this point, she was thinking of leaving. She had lined up an interview with another practice. And this is an absolutely true story. I have obviously anonymized it and changed some of the details. She was going to leave. And there are many people probably listening to this now who are thinking, yeah, I've had enough. I can really resonate with this. I'm leaving. When all this is over, I'm leaving. And so it's really important to realize how that anger depression whirlpool can actually influence your behavior. But if you understand the useful purposes of each emotion, you can actually get a completely different outcome. So let's look at what was happening for Jo. Next slide, please. Yes, this is the possible outcome of the anger depression whirlpool. Not helpful, completely explosive. I'm going to leave. I'm out of here. I've got myself another interview. I'll show you lot. You didn't look after me. I'm not going to work with you anymore. Next slide, please. And can I just go on to the next slide? They're just slightly out of order. Yes, so we're looking at the bargaining styles here. So really what Jo was doing was being passive. She was expecting other people to notice her distress. She was expecting other people to notice that she was upset, that she had suffered losses of things that were dear to her. She was expecting people to ask her, oh, what can we do to help? But she didn't actively and assertively try to recover any of those losses. She didn't say good morning to her colleagues. That was her communication of her distress. And she loitered at the practice manager's door, saying that she'd got home very late the previous evening. And unsurprisingly, the practice manager said, sort it out with your colleagues. Look, you can see I'm busy. So that really didn't work. So no wonder Jo felt depressed, helpless, hopeless, powerless. Her bargaining strategy had not worked. Her negotiation strategy had not worked because it wasn't assertive. So let's look at the assertive bargaining she could have employed. Maybe it would have been better if she'd gone to the practice manager, requested a meeting that was convenient for both the practice manager and herself, perhaps sent round an email to her colleagues, and perhaps requested an agenda item on the next partners meeting to raise her concerns. Therefore, when we use assertive bargaining, we are meeting our own needs, and we're also mindful of meeting other people's needs and allowing them to have their needs expressed as well. And in that situation, the practice manager could have said, look, I can't see you right now. I'll see you in half an hour. Is that okay with you? Jo could have said yes. She could have gone in, shut the door, had a proper meeting, said, look, this equitable working idea isn't working. I got dumped on last night and I'm not very happy about it. She could have been properly heard. She could have got an agenda item on the next partners meeting where she could have been properly heard and in a proper professional environment, behaved in a professional way and had her concerns raised and listened to and responded to properly. And what happens if perhaps the anger depression whirlpool has really got stuck in? So the anger energy is there, but the powerless, helpless, hopeless energy is there, and she becomes aggressive, like that scene of the great big explosion with the firemen outside. This was beginning to happen. She'd decided she was leaving. That's quite an aggressive stance. So another way she could have been aggressive and failed to really bargain back anything was to have stormed into the practice manager's office. I've had enough. I'm not going to be treated like this anymore. You know, have you no idea how many extras I saw last night? All my colleagues have got to change their ways. I'm furious. And I've sent round an angry email to all of them so they can stuff it. May not work. So basically, we've got these three different styles of trying to recover your losses. Now, could I ask you to go back to the previous slide? Lovely. So here we are. This is the powerful, useful purpose of our depression energy. It feels horrible. It feels powerless, helpless, and hopeless. But what it's really telling us is, hang on, have I reached my limits here? So on the one hand, Jo really thought she'd try to bargain back her hurts and her losses being heard, but actually she hadn't. And so what we often see is that people haven't employed the right bargaining strategy to really recover the losses that they have experienced. And so for that reason, they feel powerless, helpless, and hopeless and empty. And on the other side, we could say, well, Jo said, well, I'm not accepting this. This is unacceptable behaviour. I'm not going to get dumped on every time I'm not duty doctor like this. I am the go-to, nice, pleasant person, but this is getting out of control. And so she felt unable to move to acceptance and to let go of some of those losses. And because she couldn't see that her bargaining had been ineffective, and because she wasn't prepared to let go, she was stuck on this depression lay-by. I can't accept it, it's too important. I can't let it go because it's too important, but I can't seem to recover it. So I'm leaving. That's it, I'm out of here. So her depression mingled with her anger and generated this destructive energy of, well, I'll chuck my job in. I love my patients, I like my colleagues, but I'm going, and it'll show you. Now, the depression stepping stone gives us this wonderful, wonderful wisdom. It is the place of choice. It says to us, hang on a minute, have you really tried bargaining back effectively? And so I was acting as her little voice of depression. Have you really tried bargaining back effectively, Jo? And she acknowledged, no, she hadn't. She'd been completely passive. So we were moving forwards already. We were gaining ground on this problem. And then I said, and were you really trying to recover all of those losses with that one approach to the practice manager where you loitered at the door? Yeah, well, yes, of course I was. Going, you really think you're going to recover every single thing with that one approach, that one attempt at negotiation? And she could suddenly see that that's just crazy. And she saw her limits. And this is the other really useful purpose of depression, to see your limits. So I said, well, why don't we just try bargaining back one of those losses, the one that might be measurable, specific, the SMART loss, SMART. So specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. Why don't we try just looking at that loss list and choosing one loss to try and recover? And then you may be surprised at the knock-on effect from that, the domino effect or the butterfly effect from that. And she suddenly thought, well, I can see the sense in this. And I said, and you don't have to accept all of this either. You could maybe accept just one small loss. Maybe you could accept that even when you're not duty doctor, you may not get up home exactly on time, because, you know, we all know that that isn't going to happen. You're going to have to help out occasionally. But so why don't we try bargaining back one small loss? And we chose being heard. And she decided she was going to really work hard at her assertive bargaining to recover one small loss that was going to help her feel empowered, and in doing so, recover most of the other losses, interestingly. And so we devised a SMART plan. So if we could have the next 2 slides, please. So going on, that's lovely. And the next one, lovely. And so the SMART plan we chose was being heard. Now, that may not be particularly specific, but we knew exactly how we were going to approach this. We used the assertive bargaining that we touched on before. Make an appointment with the practice manager, be heard properly as a professional, make an appointment to see your colleagues, or make an agenda item to speak at the next meeting with your colleagues, and be heard professionally. And then you'll find that people will respond to you. Ask for something specific and also maybe small. Don't expect them to cover the whole thing in one go. Be reasonable, be realistic as well. And she did this. And not only did she get fully heard, because her partners are all actually reasonable, nice people, but also the domino and butterfly effect that we'll move on to in a minute was that they were so impressed with her approach and so keen to also make sure none of them got stuck with this situation, they made her lead for equitable working in the practice. And so she rolled out an initiative where everybody had workload distributed fairly, and they reviewed their team working ethos, and they reviewed their initiatives about how to divvy up work fairly. And she is now incredibly happy working there in her loved practice with her loved colleagues and her patients. She didn't leave. She didn't have to start afresh somewhere else, which would have generated numerous losses. And she said to me the other day, I can't believe it. You know, if we hadn't sat down, I'd be struggling away with COVID in a new practice somewhere that I didn't really want to move to in the first place. And so there we have a genuinely true story about what happens if you don't really acknowledge the power of some of these stuck states that can make real trouble for us. But if we understand the useful purpose of those emotions, we understand the useful purpose of the anger and the depression, the messages they're trying to give us, the signals they are giving us, then our lives can return to that joyful place where things are going well. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we have the next slide? So this is just a picture to do with butterfly effects, which Julie mentioned just there. So when we recover one small thing, and sometimes people find this quite difficult to understand, how working on one small thing can affect very much at all. But when we recover one small thing, a whole lot of other things come back simultaneously. Now, we call it the butterfly effect because I expect lots of you have heard of chaos theory. And chaos theory talks about a butterfly fluttering its wings in Singapore, affecting the weather in California or something like that. And this emotional logic is based in emotional chaos theory, except that it's the emergence of order out of chaos theory. So by getting order into one tiny area, order follows in lots of other areas. So we're thinking about Jo here. If we just have the next one, this is another picture again of her loss reaction worksheet, which we looked at before. So she regained being heard by bargaining assertively to have her agenda item listened to. But on the back of that, I was thinking she's actually recovered all of these other things as well. She's recovered fairness, being treated with consideration. She's got the respect of her colleagues back because they've invited her to take on a new role. She's therefore got her self-respect back, I would guess. She's got much more control of her workload, although in general practice, you never have 100% control of your workload. That's not realistic. And as Julie said, she may not always leave in good time, but most of the time she will, which will give back the time with her family. She's got the enjoyment of her work back because you heard the story. She's saying, well, I can't believe it. I'm still here and I'm enjoying it. So she's got faith again in the teamwork ethos of her partners and respect for them as well. So the whole thing has been recovered just by bargaining on one small thing. So that's the magic of emotional logic. And it really does work. Anything more you want to say, Julie, before we go into some questions?
Just one very quick thing, just basically on this whirlpool issue, is that when we see these preparation states, the emotions that we experience getting entangled, and you've talked very clearly about the fact that you can get drives that result from those entanglements, emotional drives that we saw with that diagram with the overlapping cards and all the different things that it can generate in some people. The most important thing to say is all of those entanglements of emotional preparation states have been medicalized with a diagnosis, a diagnostic label attached to them. And actually what we're challenging is this whole underlying understanding of what generates what we currently call mental illness. These are not illnesses. This is just emotions getting entangled that can be easily untangled using emotional logic learning, increasing our emotional awareness using the emotional logic method. And so we don't have to present ourselves to doctors and be diagnosed with anxiety, OCD, self-harming, even in some cases, suicidality. These can be unraveled, unentangled, just simply and painlessly using emotional logic. Thanks.
Can I just say also that when we were talking about depression earlier on, we're not talking about clinical depression. We're talking about the everyday feeling of powerlessness and emptiness that any of us could get and frequently do when we've got something that actually we've reached our limits on. Clinical depression can follow by the depression, this healthy depression getting mixed up in a whirlpool that can lead to clinical depression. But the depression by itself is a healthy adjustment process. It's not a clinical illness.
Yeah.
So, Daniel, I think we've got a few questions. Do you want to?
You have indeed. Thank you. That's really interesting. We've had lots of comments saying it's very interesting. The first question we had was around how is emotional logic and reactions affected by the presence of a long-term condition?
Shall I start with that one, Julie?
Yeah, you start with that one, Marion.
So long-term conditions, of course, involve masses of loss, don't they? I mean, if you're thinking about somebody with, for example, COPD, what are all the things that they used to be able to do that they can't do anymore? All the things that they would like to do, all the things that they would like, places they would like to visit, help that they would like to be to various family members. Their family members are having to look after them, and therefore the family members are having losses. So that's another thing about emotional logic, which we haven't touched on, is that it's incredibly systemic. So we like whole families to learn it if it's possible, because if you've got somebody with a long-term health condition, they can find something small that they can bargain back. There's always something. It may be really, really tiny, but there's always something that they can get back if they can name what their losses are. So for somebody, with COPD, it may be a tiny thing like, well, if my wife was to bring the bits and pieces to me, I could polish up the shoes, if anybody polishes shoes these days. But some small thing like that, that they could still do because, it's recognized that it's a value that they have to be helpful. And of course, their relatives learning it can be really, really helpful because all the people around that person with a long-term condition have got masses of loss as well. And there may be things that they can do to help. So this is really useful for carers. Carers of people with long-term conditions really benefit from emotional logic. Has that answered that one? That was Sally Parker.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Sally, whether you'd be open to unmuting and maybe I see you've put in another comment around emotional health. I just wondered whether you might be open just to.
Yes.
Has that kind of covered your
question?
I
think it has in the generality of long-term conditions, I was sort of thinking, so I have Crohn's disease, and over the years that I've had Crohn's disease, I have learnt that I cannot be on an emotional roller coaster, because if I'm on that emotional roller coaster, I am on a health roller coaster. So you know, if you've had a long-term condition like that, where your emotions have a very definite impact on physical health to the point of requiring hospitalisation, you end up tending to work very hard to stay on that even keel emotionally.
Okay, although I think I would suggest that maybe by avoiding the emotions, which is what it sounds as if you're saying you're doing, you may not be using them for their useful purposes. We would suggest that the emotions are useful as long as you don't sit on them too long, as long as you don't stay with them. If you keep moving through the process, then they don't build up that horrible physical chemical illness that you're talking about. They're not allowed to build up. So if you're getting, for example, you're getting shocked about something, and you're worried that that build-up of adrenaline and cortisol and what have you is going to upset your system, then you may be tempted to just put it into denial and pretend it's not going on, or just carry on regardless, as we say, which is fine for a while. But the trouble is the freezer gets over full eventually, and then things tend to burst out, and then it can come back with a big wham bam instead of just being coped with in small doses. So safe places are really, really important for people with long-term conditions who are worried about the effect that it has on their health. Somewhere where they can go, somebody they can talk to work out what they're going to do about whatever the situation is, so that they can move on through the process quickly. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'll have some thinking about that. It's not quite my experience, but I will think about it. Thank you.
Okay, I've put the website link in there. If you wanted to have a look, Sally, that might help.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sally, for asking the question, and thanks for a good answer there, Marion, as well, and Julie. Sue has raised a good question. So Sue, do you want to just ask?
Yeah. I was just thinking about creativity, and as we know, you know, through artists and musicians, and how, you know, over the years, maybe they may have used different substances to bring out various sort of feelings and thoughts, and how they make their creations. And how do you then link sort of emotional logic? I've sort of, I suppose, got a fear that we're trying to make it into a physical thing, that, you know, you can box it up so much that you've lost that creation, if that makes sense.
Did you want to tackle that, Julie, or shall I?
Yeah, I'll be brave. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Really, really is. I think we need to come back to the core principles. And first of all, I would say no one wants to squash anyone's creativity. Now, if we come back to core principles, our emotions are not feelings. Our emotions are biological, physiological preparation states. They are about release of hormones, enzymes, chemicals. They're about neurological connections. They are about pure physiology. That is the emotion. The emotions are universal to every single human being. Emotions then become associated with feelings and thoughts because of the way our memories are laid down and the associations are made. So we may experience anger and associate it with all sorts of other memories that we have in our brain from when we last felt anger, when other people have felt anger, what we've seen, what we've heard, what we've smelt, what we've tasted, when we experience anger in our world. The emotion remains the same. It is immovably anger with its neurochemical, physiological associated state, and the feelings and the thoughts are unique to the individual. So the creativity is to do with the feelings and the thoughts, and not the emotional chemistry. So the creativity remains because it is above and laid down separately to emotional preparation states. And there's a lot of research that shows that emotional preparation states are indeed completely universal, the same biochemistry in every single human being and possibly in most animals as well. It is related to our survival response. So shock is a threat response. Anger is part of that. It's related to our survival response. Guilt, inward searching. Have I done something wrong? Can I do something differently? Depression energy. Hang on, have I reached my limit? This emptiness is telling me something. And the creativity that can come from those emotions is coming from further laying down of neurological memory and neurological thinking processes and associations. So we're not reducing creativity down. It's not a reductionist concept where creativity is concerned. It is purely the core emotional preparation states. Yes, Marion.
I was just going to say that actually we've got lots of creative people working with emotional logic. Yeah. Many of our trainers, we've got trainers who are drama therapists, quite a number of play therapists are involved in it, an art therapist, all those sorts of people really love emotional logic. And when I'm teaching it face to face, I tend to do quite a lot of sort of creative and dramatic stuff because I love that sort of thing. So it goes very well, actually. It's very, it doesn't, they don't shout at each other. They get on pretty well.
Okay. Has that, Sue, has that answered your question? Are you
Yes,
happy?
Yeah, that makes it the layering. I understand. But I mean, I think it's probably way above me. I probably would need to spend a lot more time with you to, to understand lots more. But yeah, interesting. Thank you.
We'll book in an appointment, Sue. Okay. We actually had another question from Sally, and I'm not sure whether we covered that. So we talked about the long-term condition, but there was, do people sometimes struggle to untangle and identify the emotions they are feeling? Yes.
I've got some different cards out to wave about, to show about that. I don't know whether anybody can see these rather. These are the feelings cards. So we've got 28 little green cards for people who do struggle to identify their emotions. Very often they can identify the feelings. Now, these feelings are the ones that we've gathered from people in the southwest of England and done a sort of iterative process to work out which 4 we're going to put with each of the emotional stepping stones. And of course, in different cultures, different countries, you need totally different feelings cards. But once you've got feelings cards that you can agree 4 of these go with each emotion, then people can often relate to these little green cards if they can't relate to the orange ones. So between the two, it's very rare to find somebody who cannot in some way or another work out to identify what their emotions are. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. That's really helpful.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne and Sally. We have had another question from Jill Croskell. Jill, I wondered whether you'd be open to asking the question, or I'm happy to raise it, but if you'd like to unmute.
Okay, yeah. If I can just find it again. I was just really interested in the application, and with sort of being, resetting, I guess, after COVID, that opportunity to reset brings new opportunities, and it's about being positive. And within practice, I'm thinking about, that whole person-centered approach and reablement and enablement and all those opportunities really for people to be their best, really, I guess. And I think this really fits in with this. But I just wondered, sort of where are you embedding this, and where's that golden thread of within practice? Because I think those particular reablement, enablement, and that whole person-centered approach, it's obviously that's where it should be focused. And I just wondered, sort of practically, obviously you did give examples in practice, but just I'm from a social care background, so I'm just really interested in that it's so holistic and where that's happening really.
Well, the main place it's happening actually is in schools.
Oh, okay.
Because we've discovered that if you teach it to children when they're growing up, then it becomes a life skill that they've got right from the beginning. So that's one of the places where it's most embedded. So that I know that's not to do with healthcare, but it is preventive healthcare, if you like, if children can grow up already understanding what their emotions are for and how to use them.
Can I add in there?
Yeah.
I was just going to say, Jill, that's incredibly exciting you saying that, because we are big in schools. There's over 70 schools in the Southwest adopting this, but we're really keen to get people with vision like yourself to adopt emotional logic in their workplaces. And so you could be an early adopter, a mover and a shaker, and bring emotional logic into your workplace. I see a place for emotional logic, particularly in social prescribing, which is now rolling out across most primary care networks, where people are using social prescribing to avoid the community mental health, to avoid the other normal interventions and avenues down which patients are channeled, and to actually restore people's self-efficacy in managing their own distress and losses. And in re-ablement and enablement, there could not be a better place for emotional logic, because you're looking at the list of losses, some previous, some recovered from, and you're looking at the list of things you're left with, possibly as still little losses in your world. And you can use a very simple solution-focused approach using the emotional logic method that completely mirrors your own unique values and move forwards through that time. So it's actually hand in hand with any concept of enablement and re-ablement, but also really powerful in social prescribing. So if anyone here is listening who has a passion for social prescribing, please get in touch. And Jill, if you would like to get in touch and see how we can help you bring this into your arena, that would be fantastic.
I will do. Yeah, I mean, I just think it's that whole preventative agenda. I think for somebody who a domiciliary care is going into somebody's house with a long-term sort of, I don't know, say neurological condition, to actually have this as a sort of tool of their trade, that sort of practical application would be amazing. And I just, because it is about being your best self. And what actually is really interesting is about that sort of public health aspect as well, which I was just thinking that, it's about that self, that self-care, that sort of ability to be, a self-caring and enabling yourself as well. So yeah, that's really interesting. I found it absolutely fascinating. So thank you both.
Don't leave it there. Get in touch, even straight after this. Get in touch, ring us up, have a chat. We can really, really work together with this.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill, for another great question. I think I'm just conscious of time. We're a minute from the end, and I just want to thank everyone for all their input and thank Julie and Marion. If you have any other questions, you can continue to put them in the chat box, and we can collate those and get an answer for you. I think the best way to contact is either to contact. So we've got the EL. Is the best way to contact you via the website, or is if you let me know, then I can, if you send it to our
I'm quite happy for you to share my email address.
Okay, I'll put Marion's
and mine. Happy to field anything and be of any help I can.
Okay. Okay. So while I'm doing that, multitasking, which to a man doesn't come very easy, I've got to tell you. I'm going to tell you about the session next week, which is our second laughter size session. And if you haven't joined the laughter size, it's really natural laughter, and it's a really good session. So the gentleman who runs it's called Aaron Potesta, and he owns Laughter Size, but it's a mix of mindfulness, laughter, fun, and it's for 45 minutes, and really recommend it. So if you can join that, that's next Wednesday, 2 till 3, and once again, I just want to thank Marion and Julie for doing the 2 sessions for us. They've been great, and hopefully we can try and get some emotional logic in the Southwest. So in the future. So thanks everyone for joining. Appreciate it's really busy at the moment. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Goodbye. All right.
Thank you so much.
No, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Daniel.
No problems. All right. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Daniel. Bye.
Bye.